is, can we keep pace with a country of 1.4 billion people with like heavy focus on STEM, some top universities now? It could sort of backfire all this. This going from having, what we were just talking about before, where China's involved in a trading relationship with you, and the sort of German approach to them, to doing what Biden's doing, trying to cut them off completely. It seems it could all go horribly wrong. In the future.
That's the broader. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're sort of being a little bit sporadic with the timings at the moment. As I think I probably said in the last podcast, we couldn't do one last Friday because I was off stagging with Deputy Editor Andrew Wooden. Obviously won't be so indiscreet as to talk about what we got up to in Amsterdam, but to be honest, it wasn't that exciting. It was just sort of marathon drinking sessions and talking shit. And I was, I'm like last Monday I was 51. I'm a bit old to be doing that kind of shit.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
I forgot it was your birthday.
Yeah, don't worry.
Because you made a big deal of it last year for obvious reasons.
Yeah, because I was 50. And I got properly mashed on that day. You were out on that one, so you saw that. But no, this Monday, I got back from the stag, so obviously a lot of late nights. Got back from the stag on Sunday and slept for about 12 hours on and off. Because I was just absolutely knackered. So another little shout out, we should say, former podcast guest, Jarlath Finnegan, CEO of Giganet. He after we did podcast with him, he obviously didn't find our company too odious, and invited Ian and I out for dinner, which we finally had the day before this stag. And I thought, that's all right, we're meeting at 7:30, go out, glass of wine, steak, cheers Jarlath, see you later. Got home at fucking 1 a.m. or something.
Yeah.
And it was great. It was a lovely meal. Thanks a lot, Jarlath, if you're listening. Lovely meal at Hawksmoor, and we had wine and we had beers and we had some whiskey sours.
Yeah, quite a lot.
And so I ended up having like
any food at all.
Yeah,
food as well.
Steak and shit, as you do at Hawksmoor. Very nice steak.
It was really nice. Yeah.
In fact, I seem to remember Jarlath was like, "Oh, one for the road, lads," and I was like, "Jesus Christ, mate, I've got stagging to prepare for." So I didn't have much kit there, and then 2 nights with not much kit in Amsterdam, so hence the 12 hours kit when I got back. And then Monday I was just still feeling, which is my birthday, I was just still feeling decidedly old and tender, so I just didn't do anything and just took it easy. To be honest, my family's been trained now to just barely even give a toss, because I don't really give a toss about birthdays. So I go, it's my birthday. Oh, all right, Dad, happy birthday. And that's about the long and short of it.
Yeah.
No cakes, no dicking about.
No cakes? Come on.
No, I can't be bothered with it. It's just, you just got a bit older.
No
it's
gifts?
A big deal. No gifts.
Sorry, so just a Monday.
Pretty much, yeah.
You didn't even get bought a bottle of scotch or anything?
No.
Bottle of
no, and I'm totally fine with it. I just, it's not I hate birthdays. I'm just indifferent about them.
I usually get bought something, not something extravagant, but someone usually gets me a big bar of Toblerone or a Glenmorangie half bottle or something.
I mean, I can't be getting far short of the age where people are going to start buying me joke presents like walking sticks and incontinence pants and that sort of thing. So we'll see. So that was that. What else? Yeah, so nothing to reflect on Andrew's thing other than Andrew was properly seen off. That's that really.
What state was he in?
He was struggling a bit on Saturday morning, or about Saturday lunchtime when I saw him. But then he rallied magnificently. And then we managed to stay out till about, I think I got to bed about 6 a.m. on the Saturday night,
what
Sunday
time did
morning.
You travel back?
And I can point out that in central Amsterdam, the McDonald's is open 24/7.
Yeah.
And you can imagine what shit show that is at about 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. whenever we were there.
Is that the one near? Yeah,
it's near the station, near the hole, all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Amsterdam's funny. When I've done Amsterdam in the past, I've done different bits of it. And we're going back, aren't we, on Monday for Network X, little trailer for Network X. Which is an Informer-run telecoms event in Amsterdam. So we're going back, and Andrew and I were just chatting about it, like in preparation. We're going, I presume you agree with me, Andrew, that you have little appetite for getting fucked up in Amsterdam. What was I going to say? Yeah, it's weird, just a bit. So normally when I've gone there, I've walked around the nice little concentric canal-y bits,
Yeah.
which even though they're technically touristy and right in the centre, they still have a sort of unhectic feel about them. But then if you go over to more the red light district, which is where you tend to go in a stag, it's where the bars and everyone is, it's basically just given over to exploiting stags.
Yeah.
Mm.
And there's only about sort of 4 or 5 themed. Like every restaurant is an Argentine steakhouse.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be Argentine.
Or pizza,
Yeah, all slices of pizza, all that sort of thing. And then there's Irish bars.
Mm-hmm. You've got to have an Irish bar.
I've got one funny anecdote from an Irish bar we went to. Went to one and there was an Irish guy actually working behind it, but he was really stressy. In fact, this happened in 2 separate Irish bars we went to. We went, and you normally there's a group of you. There was like 6, 7, 8 of us on this stag trip. You go in and go, and then you're sort of going through whatever he wants. And a couple of people want lagers, a couple of people want ales, a couple of people want rum and coke or whatever. And you do them bit by bit. And these guys get really arsey. They're like, "Can you just order it all at once?" And I was like, "All right." And in this one bar, one of us was ordering these things, and the bloke goes, "Right, you're just taking a piss now." I said, "Taking a piss? I'm coming up to a bar and a pub and ordering drinks, and that's me taking the piss." Anyway, and then later on...
How weird.
Yeah, I know, he's just a very stressy person.
He wasn't joking when he said you just taking a piss?
No, he was just stressed
serious.
out. And then later on, we were standing around a table, and he came over to me and just said very rudely, "Move, I want to shift the table." And I thought, "You fucking prick." So I just looked at him. I thought, if he's going to get that wound up, let's see how much I can wind him up more. Yeah. So I just looked at him blankly, and he went, "Move." And I just went, and in the end, and he went, "Are you going to move or not?" I went, "In a minute." And he went, "No, now." I went, "In a minute."
Oh my God.
And anyway, and then he went off and got a bouncer and got us all kicked out of the pub for me doing that. It's just bizarre. But then, they probably have so many randoms coming through, they don't care about alienating. It's not like I'm going to...
Yeah.
It's not like I'm going to...
You're not repeat business.
It's like a Wolf of Wall Street type of situation where this is your version as you thought happened, but then from the outside you were like totally unacceptable.
Yeah. You mean like when he did all those lewds?
I found that bit of Amsterdam to be quite rude as well.
Yeah.
And not when I've been out on a stag do, just going in on business trips probably and trying to get a drink. Do you remember last year when we were there and they were still doing the whole COVID pass thing?
That's right.
And I tried to get in. They wouldn't let me in even though I had the thing, and he was really quite abrupt about it. And then I remember one time being there with Ken Wheeland, who's one of our freelancers, and we were in till quite late, and they just started putting chairs on the tables, but really loudly, like right next to your ear, and as a sort of like it's time to get out now.
And it's a part of town where you've got barely dressed women standing in windows. I mean, it's just a very weird place.
It is weird.
And then you've got the other obvious theme in Amsterdam, which I stress I didn't partake of because we were chatting about beforehand, because it just doesn't mix well with a stag, is the coffee houses. The coffee houses. No, I didn't partake of any barely dressed women either. The coffee houses. So I guess they've just got a lot of people turning up looking to get off their tits. So looking at it from their point of view, they probably have to deal with a lot of weirdness.
Totally.
And so everyone just gets clumped in. I do get the impression of sort of exploitation. I think there are a few times where a round was far more expensive than it should have been because they just see you coming.
Yeah.
But, it's a weird place, Amsterdam, like that. And then right next door, there's it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
It is odd. Yeah.
So we're looking forward to going back again on Monday.
Yeah, well,
I won't be going to that shitty bit, that's for sure. And I've had enough of that. Okay, that's probably enough. Unless anyone else has got anything to talk about. No. Okay. So I keep forgetting. I'm going to remember it now. I keep forgetting to just remind you where you can see it if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook. Which apparently most people listen to it on audio, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. I use an app called Podcast Addict, which seems to get the pod just fine. So what are we going to chat about this week? So Ian and I both spent yesterday afternoon/evening writing about another former podcast guest leaving his employer, who's Neil McRae, who's still, as we speak, the chief architect at BT. But by the end of the year, will no longer be. But that was... I
didn't really write much about him in my coverage.
Well, I was just about to say, it's not just about Neil. I did, because as I said to you before, in my time as a journalist, I've realised that major mover and shaker stories tend to get a nice lot of clicks, and I'm just a cynical clickbait bitch. But it was part of a broader reshuffle, and we'll spend more time chatting about that than Neil, partly because hopefully we'll get Neil on again soon, and we can hear his side of things. Or he might be wanting to be mega discreet and not talk about it.
He might want to talk about what he's going to do next, because he hasn't really said much yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised if he was just going to suddenly throw a bomb at BT. Who knows? I've got absolutely no. I haven't chatted to him. I managed to get a written quote from him for my story. But I look forward to having him on just because he's a good lad and obviously has forgotten more about all this stuff than I'll ever know. You're right, Ian. Ian's sort of staring in a concerned way at his phone.
It's just people sending texts about work. It's
okay, fine. Work. Fuck work. Who cares about work?
Yeah.
We'll talk more broadly about what this says about BT and the environment in which it exists that might have brought about this cabinet reshuffle. And then maybe related to
another cabinet reshuffle.
So oh my God. Just on my way in, this utter shit show. I mean, I'm not party political. I probably, on a given day would be more likely to vote Tory and Labour, but not because I have any affection for Tories, just because I prefer a smaller state if possible. Not that the Tories deliver that. But yeah, on my way in, we got this new leader, a new Chancellor of the Exchequer. Chancellor of the Exchequer comes out with this thing, goes, I tell you what, let's cut loads of taxes and borrow loads of money. And then everyone freaked out, and now he's been sacked.
Yeah.
So, yes, it's all just
Kwasi.
appalling. But that's not what this pod's about, so we won't go on about that. No. But yeah, one segue that the BT cabinet reshuffle might lead us to talk about is the latest US attack on the Chinese tech sector. And you wrote an excellent piece, and I wrote a more bog standard piece on the sort of collateral damage from that. And also, we're just going to speculate. I don't know what the fuck the end game is.
No, I don't either.
So there's that, and then I think the last thing, sticking to the sort of more geopolitical theme, I thought it was very interesting. There's a sort of conglomeration of European telecoms / electronics / tech regulators called BEREC, who come out with a preliminary report on this. We've spoken about it on the pod once or twice recently, on these operators constantly hassling and saying big tech should chip in for the cost of networks. And they come out with a preliminary report that goes, I can't see much merit to that.
Good on them.
So those are three things that we'll talk about. This is normally when I do that, if you're going to watch it. I've just got completely out of sync. And you stop.
People like the randomness.
Yeah. Well, anyone who's been listening to a few times presumably has their expectations managed about my competence. Cool. Right. So let's start. So Neil, I've got to give a shout out. I didn't give him a nod in the story I wrote because I didn't refer to any of his reporting, because I ended up, hearing from source, both Neil and from sort of BT spokespeople. But I'll give him a shout out anyway. The scoop was Ray Lemaitre, our former colleague who's now at Telecom TV. And yeah, I mean, on one level, sort of people leaving, sort of executive appointment stories / leaving stories are sort of gossipy and salacious, and who really cares? But I found, as I alluded to earlier, in journalism, people want to read it.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, a good journalist, while a good journalist should seek truth and objectivity, we are at the mercy of our audience. And if our audience, I discovered early on, the good thing about being an electronic journalist, an online journalist, is you can see immediately who's reading what. And, very early, 8+ years ago when I started this job, I realised that big kit vendor stories, Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, and big operator stories, Vodafone, AT&T, whatever, get more reads than other stuff. So there is a degree of feedback loop.
Yeah.
And I've found that these sorts of big stories, these sorts of senior execs coming and going stories get some reads, and so it's turned out with the thing. So I even stayed up late writing it yesterday because I had to juggle several balls. I sort of wrote the story, then picked my son up from work, then cooked steak and chips for the family, and then published the story. So that's what it's like being a busy working hack. So I'll soon hand over to you, Ian, because as usual I've just sort of prattled and not given you a chance to get a word in edgeways. But Neil McRae, who's been on the pod, who's the chief architect, is leaving. And this is part of a general reshuffle of his bosses, who's the overall CTO of BT, is called Howard Watson, who we will have mentioned in recent pod because we were at a BT thing at their sort of Star Wars boardroom thing. He's basically, I mean, he hasn't been promoted because the only way further up from CTO is CEO.
Yeah.
But he seems to have been given an expanded role where it's networks and security. And then within that, he's promoted there were 3 people. I actually found a sort of BT org chart. I wonder if it's changed since I put it up last night. No, it hasn't. So there was Howard Watson at the top, and then there were 3 people on the next rung below him. A chap called Greg McCall, who was MD of Service Platforms. Neil McRae, who on this is called MD Architecture. And then a chap called Andy Skingley, who I hadn't heard of before, who was the MD of Dynamic Infrastructure. I don't even know what Service Platforms or Dynamic Infrastructure
Well, they're
mean.
very sort of arcane titles, aren't they? But and they seem to become, some of the stuff they're talking about in their reorg seems to sound even more arcane.
Well,
actually.
quite.
Some of these subdivisions now within the technology group.
Yeah.
But
Well, exactly.
I can't
And
quite
anyway,
understand why they've done it the way they have. It's like it's not intuitive, is it?
So what seems to be, and I'll make my quick observation about it and then cede the floor. So McRae's going, Skingley is apparently retiring, and McCall is now just sort of his title is sort of like head of networks. You've met McCall, have you?
Yeah, because BT did. You weren't there actually. I don't know why.
Probably couldn't be bothered.
Might have been, but it was only in central London. They did a 5G core update, if you remember, earlier this year. And it involved going to the Green Planet.
That's probably what put me off. I think Andrew went to that.
Well, that was quite good.
Right.
That Green Planet thing was only, for a start, it was only like, it wasn't a big chunk of your day. And it was quite impressive to see some of the technology that they're talking about with 5G core in action.
Fair enough.
You know, and then it was a sit down to the PR. But Greg McCall was the most senior executive at that. I think.
He's very much the most senior exec now.
Yeah.
So he's now just called Chief Networks Officer.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that the chief architect role probably has been absorbed into that.
Him, yes.
So my guess, and this is definitely not coming from Neil, the only stuff I've heard from Neil is what I put in the story, which is a fairly generic, he's looking forward to building the best networks in the world type of comment, is that, so there were these 3 people on even... And if McRae was going to hang around, he'd probably have to report into McCall, which would have felt like a bit of a demotion. That's just my guess.
Maybe.
But anyway, so that's that. And as you say, Ian, I'll just say one last thing, to save you having to list it off because I've got my laptop up in front of me. So Howard Watson is now Chief Security and Networks Officer, perhaps telling that security comes first in that job title as well. And then his revamped networks organisation will consist of the following sort of silos: network services, strategy and research, which would have been the obvious place for Neil McRae to go, I think, cyber and information security, operational resilience, and service management. I
mean, some of those things sound like they're doing the same thing to me. That's the
service management, security transformation, health and safety, anyway, all kinds of stuff. So, any thoughts about Neil, and then more generally the reshuffle? How does it come over?
I mean, on Neil, it's one of those, whenever you hear about executives leaving, you always try and figure out, did they leave of their own accord, or was there some amicable understanding, or did they sort of want to get the person out? And when I heard this, it's very hard to figure out really what's gone on. I think it's.
Oh, we're only speculating. But we'll admit
sometimes you can see there's been developments where, something that a department's done hasn't worked very well, and like, for instance, a good example I think is Vodafone with Vodafone Germany, which was not performing very well for a while, and apparently had this real cock up with an IT systems upgrade, and then Hans Amitsreiter, who was the CEO, sort of then left, and you kind of put 2 and 2 together, and it's like looks like he's probably been pushed a little bit to leave.
Yeah. Someone's got to fall on a bit like Quasi.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think all this fuck up that's going on right now is all on Quasi, but he's had to fall on his sword.
And I can't get any sense at all with this whether what the reason really for Neil leaving is. I mean, on a personal note, I would say, I mean, we've had him on the podcast before. I think it's a real loss from the perspective of the media, because
from a comms
side of thing, I think it's a massive loss. Because now maybe the comms team at BT and the people who surround that don't feel the same way, although I think some of them would. But he's someone who
Bet you if we got him on background.
Yeah, I don't know, because I mean he's someone who,
you know who you are. We'll take you out for a beer.
He puts his views out there. You know, he's not afraid of sharing an opinion. You know, I mean he's said himself sometimes that he's come out with things that have then turned up in the press the next day, and it's like, oh, you know.
Well, that's the
you know, he tweets and
those are the pros and cons, isn't it?
Yeah, and
whereas Howard Watson, for example, is a good communicator, but he seems much more polished, much more reserved.
Completely. And we've been at a round table with Neil talking about, which is on the record, talking about Open RAN and things, and he's got very strong views about that. And you know,
do you think that might have been? I mean, again, we're completely speculating, but given that he seems to be slightly resisting the overall industry current, to be very pro Open RAN and very pro public cloud.
Well, I think a lot of people feel like Neil does. It's just they don't want to say it. You know, I think we hear a lot about Open RAN, and I think if you go and talk to people who are actually dealing with the technology, you'd hear the sort of concerns that Neil comes out with more. And you do. Journalists do get told those things. People say, you know, it's not really ready, but there's this layer at the top of, Open RAN, you know, it's all wonderful, we need to work to have more diversity and it's going to solve the world's problems. There's that kind of marketing bullshit that you have to sort of get underneath, and that's why Neil's great, I think, because he was prepared to, I mean, he's
prepared to be a straight talker.
I sat next to him, I think, at that round table, and then it got to the stage in the day when everybody's just sort of this general chit chat, and
when everyone's had a few glasses,
and just found out a bit more about his background, and you know, he got into software at quite an early age. I think he's a sort of space enthusiast. He's a real sort of tech kind of,
he's a proper geek
tech
in the
nerd.
nicest sense of the
exactly.
word. Yeah,
and really knows his stuff, you know, and he's a proper coder and everything, and in his spare time he sort of he's really keen on pinballs, and he's got them all sort of software connected. There's an app that you can sort of look at to sort of check scores, and you know, and he does, and he's
living the dream.
Yeah, and he's really sort of interested in technology and software at a kind of really core level. You know, he's not just a manager. He's very sort of hands-on type of guy. So he really knows his stuff. So when he comes out and says it's complicated to do, you know, you look at the chip technology and it's not as cheap as everybody says it is. I don't believe the cost advantage, and you know, and I've worked with suppliers and I've got rid of them and I've saved costs, whereas if you add more in, you're more likely. You've got to take him seriously because he's a hands-on guy who's done this stuff, and I think it's really nice to have somebody like that who sort of deals with the press, and he's also very likable. I think he's quite a colourful character, and he's fun. He's sort of fun to go out with. So I think on a sort of personal note, I think it's kind of a shame that he's not going to be at BT anymore. And I hope wherever he does go, it's somewhere where he's quite prominent still and involved in the industry. Because it'd be a shame if he just sort of disappears and we don't see much.
Well, judging by I might as well read it out. Yeah. It's quite short. So the quote I got from him, and this is me just emailing him, going, "Look, you got anything to say?" If I put double quote marks there, how annoying. It's terrible sometimes reading yourself and realising you're self-proofing leaves a bit of room for improvement. He goes, "My passion is to build networks to enable customers and our communities to be all they can be. That's why I build the best networks in the world." Bit immodest there. And in future, that's what I'm going to be doing.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, he's basically saying, look, you could read between lines and say perhaps he felt that he was no longer able to do that at BT, but I chose not to speculate in the piece. He's basically just going to go and find somewhere that wants someone who's passionate about networks. So fair play to him.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he'll. It'd be hard to see him going to a direct rival in a way, because sometimes there's contractual stuff about that, isn't there? Maybe he'd
certainly have at least 6 months of sort of gardening leave.
Yeah, it's gardening leave.
And he's hanging around.
Maybe he'd go to a vendor.
He's hanging around properly at BT till the end of the year. So I must assume he hasn't got something lined up at Vodafone or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as I say, I just hope he doesn't sort of disappear. I mean, on the broader thing,
it doesn't sound like he wants to.
On the broader thing, not just looking at Neil, but what they've done. Again, I find it a little bit hard to sort of figure out what spurred all this. Really, there's a lot of stuff in the conversations that I had that you'd have had as well with the people sort of dealing with it all, about putting the emphasis on security, and the other word they use was simplification. And when people talk about simplification and they've restructured the department, it often means they're trying to get rid of roles, and if they've sort of carved out new bits and got rid of one person, you sort of think there's going to be a knock-on effect that filters down through the technology organisation, and maybe we're going to see more people leaving. And the interesting thing I think that's happened with BT is a little bit like Vodafone in a way. They've got this almost a separate digital thing going on now,
right,
with Harmeen Mehta, I think she's called, who's from Bharti, came from Bharti Airtel,
Okay.
who's now leading that, which sounds like there's a little bit of potential overlap between that digital unit she has and what maybe some of the guys in the technology organisation were doing. But I did ask them directly, are there job cuts planned? When you're talking about simplification, does that? And they said no, there's none planned. But then on the other hand, they didn't sort of rule it out completely. They said, well, they sent a statement saying we're always looking for efficiency. Benefits and ways to make the company more efficient, and they've cut jobs in the last few years. They've cut a lot of jobs. They've cut 10,000, I think.
And Kwasi Kwarteng yesterday said he's going nowhere, and today he got sacked.
Well, exactly. So that's one thing that occurred to me is part of this aimed at at making it a leaner organisation. But then you look at all these little units they've carved out, and it sounds almost more complicated. And I don't quite understand
It does a bit. Let's get into
some of these units.
Let's just briefly. I mean, we're just speculating. The network services, that kind of makes sense. Strategy and research, that makes sense. Cyber and information security, that makes sense. And then you get into this sort of long tail. Operational resilience and service management.
Well, that to me sounds like network services and the security one that you just mentioned.
Yeah,
like it sounds like the same thing. I don't get it.
And then they got another security one, which is called security transformation,
right,
and health, safety, and environment. So,
well, that sounds like you say, it's another security one. Why do you need three with security in? And the HSE to me is a personnel thing, isn't it? It's not it's a corporate. It's something sticking around your report
thing. I mean, they might as well just put health, safety, tree hugging, and
I don't see what that's got to do with the technology organisation, really, other than you try and find more efficient technologies and there's an environmental benefit. But,
yes, I agree. It seems like an expansion of the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So go on.
The only other thing is this whole security thing, security. I mean, it's very interesting. This is the week. I know we're going to have this.
I was about to say that. So
bringing it up a bit,
stuff.
Maybe a bit too soon. But
no, not at all. I was going to say it just now.
This all coincides this week, interestingly, with the government updating its rules on the Huawei swap out.
Did you write that up separately?
No.
Oh, I thought of it, but
no.
I mean, you noticed something that I missed.
I reached out to BT today, actually, because I'd sort of missed a lot of this. I don't know why, because one time it was the only thing I seemed to be writing about. But it seems over the last sort of few months, BT's been lobbying to have an extension of this deadline for taking Huawei out of the core. Not the radio side of things or other bits, but the core network.
And what was
the
deadline?
Kind of control centre of the network. So the original deadline was January next year, which is pretty bloody soon now.
Yeah.
And it looks like
they're struggling.
They're struggling to do that. I got a statement from them, which is in our Eurobytes column today, but I can't exactly. But it did attribute some of it to COVID and pandemic-related delays in stuff. And essentially, if you talk to anybody about the core network and changing that and replacing vendors and moving systems onto a new core, it sounds like it's incredibly complicated. Yeah, it's like a big sort of software job where
and of course
lots can go wrong, and therefore it sounds like they've just not been able to do it as quickly as they were maybe hoping, or the government was telling them, and they've lobbied to have an extension. The government's agreed. They're basically giving them another 12 months almost. It's now December 2023 before.
Do you want me to read the statement? Is
yeah,
that
go
relevant?
on then. Yeah, is it on Paul's?
I've just looked it up.
Yeah,
BT spokesperson said, quote, COVID has created unprecedented and unforeseen challenges to operators' Huawei replacement programs, and these square brackets, new close square brackets deadlines will allow us to continue at pace without compromising service or resilience. So basically saying we need more time.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any other operator actually that has Huawei in the core. So,
and that was always a thing, and that was an EU legacy thing. With
Ericsson, Nokia. I think 3's Nokia mainly, but maybe with some other stuff in there. And I think Vodafone is a mixture now of Cisco and Ericsson. So I don't think anybody else has got this Huawei core situation. So the only company really I think that would have been lobbying for this rule change is the incumbent.
Can I just say, Paul Rainford's byline photo, he looks like
he looks like a nutter, does he?
He looks quite handy, doesn't he? He looks like, don't fuck with me.
Yeah, well, he changed that because the other one before was even more like, don't fuck with me. Apparently, Ray took it and asked him to pull a nasty face, and then he hated it for years.
Well, because he always used to have that. Ray used to have a really quirky photo, didn't he?
And Paul hated his. He said it made him look like someone was about to punch someone.
Yeah,
in the pub.
exactly.
So he wanted to get rid of it.
Whereas Paul's just the most sort of, gentle,
totally.
easygoing bloke.
Yeah.
Well, unless you get him onto certain aspects of politics, but we won't go there. Okay.
Yeah, so I find it curious that there's this big sort of. I mean, it was also interesting in the comments I got about what Howard Watson does on a day-to-day basis. There's all this stuff like he liaises with security agencies and he works with businesses on security matters. It sounds like clearly companies are really worried about security these days. The fact that we've become more dependent on technology during the pandemic, we've got this horrible situation going on in Russia, and they're notorious apparently for hacking and trying to get into networks and upset elections and all this sort of stuff.
There's not much you would put past Russia these days.
And the Chinese have been blamed for trying to infiltrate networks through vendors and other stuff. It's not a surprise that companies are more concerned now about security risks than
I
ever.
think, but more pertinently, because they've always been bad actors, there's always been aggro.
Yeah.
You made the point about this press release that neither of us wrote up, but we both acknowledged, which is from DCMS, which is the comms part of the government. And I got to admit, I missed what you spotted. I thought it was just a legal formalisation of something that everyone already knew, which is kind of how they spun it on the top. And it's like, we're making it official. It's now illegal. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. Otherwise, you're breaking the law. Yeah. Whereas previously, I mean, they were going to do it anyway because the government told them to do it. It just felt like a legal rubber stamp. But you spotted that they've given BT basically another year, haven't they?
Yeah.
So that's quite a big deal.
It is, and it's just interesting that there's this whole like we're more focused on security now more than ever. I mean. People who were sort of being slightly awkward and trying to sort of draw attentions to contradictions will say, well, they've got Huawei in their network for another year, and they're talking about being the most secure network there is. And that's supposedly the area of the network that you definitely don't want a bad actor to be in is the core. That's the bit that everybody says it's not as much of a problem in the radio access boxes because
I'd like to see, and this is going to be relevant to the next segment we talk about. I'd still like to see some evidence of what. Let's assume all the claims are true.
Yeah,
and that Huawei, at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party, is using its embedded kit in our networks to get up to all kinds of fucking shifty stuff.
Yeah.
I'd just like to know what that is.
Well, they could shut a network down.
Which they never have.
No, but they could do.
Yeah. So we're protecting ourselves from future threats there. That's fine.
Yeah.
Although they're hypothetical.
Yeah.
But I just wonder if they've done anything now. Do they think that they've tapped into,
Yeah, I mean, so I've talked to a couple of people about this, and some of them are telco execs, and one's a security expert called Carsten Knoll, who is like he's very highly regarded as German security. So he's a hacker basically. He hacks into companies' networks. They pay him to do it.
Oh right, so he's poacher turned gamekeeper type of.
Yeah, and then he basically
he goes.
You'll know when he's fixing here, and then they fix it, and then he hacks in again, and then it goes for several rounds.
Yeah.
And I saw him speak online on a sort of conference in Amsterdam that I watched, and I wrote about it, and then he got in touch with me and said, "Do you want a longer chat?" And I asked him about the Huawei thing, and is it feasible that even when they're only in the radio access network, which is very software based these days, obviously as well,
so, yeah.
you could basically turn it off, and he was like, "You could,
Yeah.
and
I could."
And he was like, "Well." He said the reason I don't worry about it that much, and I don't sort of spend my nights sort of staying awake about things like that, is because if China did that, if it gets to the point where China says to Huawei, turn off BT's network, we're in a World War III situation, aren't we? Why would they do that if we weren't in a kind of World War III situation?
Again, this is going to be relevant to the next segment. Okay, so. Yeah, I agree. I think it's not a coincidence that BT is making a public show of going, we really give a fuck about security at a time where our government, US government, presumably other governments that we're friendly with, like Western Europe and Five Eyes and all that shit, Anglosphere, I suppose we should call it, are all sort of ramping it up.
Yeah,
and
well,
you know,
Germany's the one that surprises me. Because they're all Huawei's all over the German networks,
Yeah.
and they've not really had any concerted effort to get it out, except for in the core. But there's been none of the equivalent.
Well, Germany's
stuff
a bit
going
weird,
on.
and general geopolitical stuff. If you look, a little tangent, if you look at the whole Ukraine thing,
Well, it's the same with Ukraine. They're heavily reliant on Chinese infrastructure, and they're heavily reliant on Russian gas.
Russian gas.
And their former chancellor did very well out of being heavily reliant on Russian gas at a personal
Schroeder,
level.
you're talking about?
No, Gerhard Schroeder,
Yeah, yeah.
who's now the chairman of Nord Stream 2.
Yeah.
And one of Putin's best mates by all accounts,
Right,
and not
he's
very
like
popular in
hanging
Germany
out with him
anymore.
and doing vodkas together.
And clearly, the whole thing with China in terms of getting Chinese infrastructure from Huawei and using it extensively across telecom networks is China is Germany's biggest trading partner after the. I think export wise, they export more maybe to the US, and then it's China. Like they sell loads of machine tools.
And Germany's a
cars.
massively export-driven economy.
Yeah, and they get more from China in terms of imports than any other country in the world.
Right.
Than most of their imports are basically coming from China. So it's a very awkward relationship for them
And Germany,
economically
it's
to upset.
interesting. I mean, I don't necessarily criticise them for it, but they have left themselves, because they've been so open to economic interdependence with these countries, that it's not become as a newsflash that there might be some aggro with Russia.
Yeah.
It's been going on since 1945.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not come as a news flash that there might be a bit of aggro with China. Certainly, if you listen to Trump and his China, we're at least sort of 5 or 10 years into that.
Well, I think if you're going to be sympathetic to, I mean, they obviously during the communist era, Europe didn't have heavy reliance on Russian gas during the communist era.
Yeah.
This is something that's come about since the 1990s,
And maybe the incorporation of East Germany made it all the more easier for Germany to do it.
Yeah. So, and I think if we're going to be sympathetic towards them, I think there's this argument which I think applies to China a lot as well, that if you trade with these countries and you try and make them part of the global trade system, that's the best way to bring them on board and make them see the value of being democratic and having other things that we have. And
lots of people
hasn't really worked that way.
Well, you say that, but I see lots of pundits talking about how it didn't work with China. And it hasn't worked if we're talking about regime change. If we're talking about our own sort of narcissistic, everywhere's got to turn into some variation of American culture, an American political system, which doesn't have much to fucking commend itself anyway at the moment. But if you talk about interdependence and you look at all the aggro that's going on at the moment, less so Russia. I mean, I've been listening to far too many podcasts recently where I've got America's talking about how they're really shitting themselves about nuclear war, which is somewhat unnerving.
Well, the Americans.
Yeah, just pundits saying, look, this is serious.
To be honest with you, that to me is just Americans. They're all out in the woods buying rifles and swapping dollars for peanuts and
these are
cans of beans.
I don't just listen to I don't listen to people from Deliverance on podcasts.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't. That's beside the point. The point is, there are a lot of people whose opinions I respect who seem to be quite worried about the.
Well, it is worrying. I'm not saying we shouldn't worry at all, because it is worrying.
People are saying it's like it's at the worst state since fucking.
I mean, you've got a figure threatening to use his nuclear weapons. Basically, he's done it several times now.
Yeah,
and it's a question: is he bluffing, or is he? Would he really do it? And I don't think we want to sort of.
And then you look at all the various people. Putin, who seems to be this old school megalomaniac, and you look at the people we got in charge. We can't even find politicians who can hang around for more than a couple of weeks without dropping the ball. Americans have got this senile puppet.
Yeah.
The Germans seem to be all over the place.
He's got their hand up his Jaxie. If he's a senile puppet.
Nancy Pelosi. It's just the Democrat Party, isn't it?
Kamala.
But Nancy Pelosi's no spring chicken. There's photos of her hanging out with fucking Jesus. And
when she's not flying into Taiwan and causing
and just being weird.
World War III.
I mean, they all just do weird things because they're old. That happens. I can relate to it. I'd certainly do my fair share of weird things as I get older, and I'm only 51. Anyway, and these people are like 80.
Imagine what you're going to be doing.
Exactly, let alone 30 years' time.
Parachuting into Taiwan and saying,
this place is like 30 years older than me, and she's the puppet master of the US political system right now. Anyway, we digress. But anyway, back to the security stuff. You can see why BT would read the sort of writing on the wall. Everyone's shitting themselves about security. We've got Putin going on about nukes. We've got the thing that we're going to talk about, which is America seems intent on escalating with China the whole time. And I can only assume that every now and then China does something that brings about this escalation. I can't believe China's just completely passive part of this equation.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure what it is. It's a bit like with Huawei. I mean, maybe Huawei did do something. I've just never seen what it is. And so there's all this aggro. And I think everyone knows that one of the ways...
Well, I think what it is to be Chinese.
Well, yeah. That seems to be a thing, doesn't it? But I think, other stuff I read where people talk about nukes and that sort of thing, but they talk a lot. There's a sort of cliche that says the next world war will be a cyber war.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a sort of pundit smart-ass thing to say. And obviously, there's cyber war, and then they're sending the lads in with guns and rockets and bombs.
But even a cyber war would lead to that, because it would lead to widespread chaos and looting and a breakdown of order.
But I think it's one of those ways in which you can skirt around a war.
Yeah.
So that's something that we've been doing ever since the Second World War, ever since nukes were invented. We've tried to find ways. Eddie Izzard once had a bit on this that was really good. We just want to have little wars. Little mini wars. Don't get too carried away. Just a little war there. And we've got to have a war. Everyone accepts that we've got to have a war every now and then because, for some reason.
What people do.
Yeah, it's what you fucking do, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's rude not to. But let's have a little war that doesn't involve nukes and that sort of thing. And cyber war is obviously a way of being belligerent and damaging your opponent without resorting to full-blown conventional war. So all these things are leading up to, I can see why BT would want to be seen to be being a lot more full on. Whether or not all these new little silos that we just listed,
I don't know, but security is clearly a massive topic for network companies these days, and a lot of the stuff we've been talking about on the pod for months and months and months to do with the public cloud and heavy reliance on those systems, and they're all under the control of only a small number of companies, as we've said. I think everybody needs to be pretty hyper aware of this stuff, and I've no doubt that Howard Watson, when these notes came through about all this sort of restructuring that you'd have had as well, and it was like he spends a lot of his time talking to security agencies and government watchdogs and businesses. I bet that's the first thing a lot of businesses say when they're dealing with BT, the enterprise stuff, is, can you guarantee security for us? Can you make sure?
Yeah, BT's in a unique position as well.
Yeah.
So BT has probably got more pressure than any other telco in the UK.
Yeah, this is something that would definitely concern Three a lot less than Howard Watson. I'm not saying that they wouldn't be worried about security. Of course they would. They don't want their customers being hacked and information disappearing. But they're a much more consumer-focused mobile company than BT is. So, I think it's... I think a lot of this, putting security at the top of the agenda is not really surprising.
Just remains to be seen. And as I said in my story, that's all well and good, but now Howard Watson is presumably happy with the outcome of this reshuffle.
It sounds like he led it.
Well, yeah. But I mean, it would have come from the very top and from even further up than that.
I guess.
But, so now the of the three people that reported directly into him, two of them are clearing off. That leaves Greg McCall. Presumably Howard Watson and Greg McCall got a good, strong working relationship. And then he'll put people in charge of those various other silos. But he's obviously still got to get on with the day job, which is... what was there a thing? I think there was a story recently. Maybe it is Omdia. And I know we might talk about another Omdia story, but maybe it was someone else. Fuck, I can't remember. Anyway, someone had us way down the list of... There was some metric of global sort of fibre rollout competence.
Right, yeah.
And we were something like 54th in the world or some shit like that.
That's probably more of a Clive Stelly type thing, I think, the fibre rollout, who's the CEO of Openreach.
But I wonder what the working relationship is between Howard Watson and Clive Stelly.
Yeah, I would imagine they have quite a lot to do with each other.
It's still a tech thing, isn't it?
Yes, of course. And they're supposed to be Chinese walls, aren't they? They're not supposed to have much to do with each other at all.
That's not the best kind of wall to be referring to in this context. Yeah, I know. And they're semi-autonomous, but that was a great fudge, that. Everyone was clamouring for Openreach to be spun off. They went, I tell you what, we'll make them autonomous. But we still own them, and they still report.
Well, lots
to
of people
us.
have done it. A lot have fudged it that way. It's quite a common thing, I think, with the way that people have approached this thing.
I know.
don't think it's just
amazing
a
how
UK
people just
thing.
go, all right, then that's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how this all pans out really over the next few months, and we find more out from hopefully Neil if he wants to sort of divulge a bit more while he's still at BT, obviously, and say what he's going to do, and we get a sense of what these new units are doing as well, the 6 of them that there are, because I don't really get how they've decided on some of those.
No,
they sound it's a bit arcane.
A bit arbitrary. They just seem a bit arbitrary.
Yeah.
They go, let's have another one that's got resilience and trees and unisex toilets. Fuck it.
Yeah.
Put them all into one.
And then we'll have a fried breakfast one.
Full English unit. Make sure everyone's got full English every morning. Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, we keep alluding to the US stuff. So
Yeah.
I'll do a quick intro, but you wrote a more comprehensive piece than I did. In my defence, I'm the editor, so I do have 2 other things. Whereas all you got to do is write your great big pieces. But I'm pretty sure I linked to you. Yeah, I did. So I wrote a piece. The headline was "Chip Sector Further Damaged by Latest US Restrictions," and it was a very short one, and it was mainly a collation. There's about 10 hyperlinks in it, including to your story, and then including to various like Reuters, Associated Press, FT, Wall Street Journal, usual suspects. Just going how it kind of, maybe because I was off last Friday, they announced this new raft of export. So the US for about 2 or 3 years has been doing export bans, initially just focused at sort of Huawei and ZTE, trying to find ways of preventing US companies from doing business with them. And then that seems to have metastasized and grown. And then they're trying to stop more US companies doing more business with more Chinese companies. And the overall aim seems to have been to ultimately inhibit the Chinese tech sector on the whole, or at very least to say if they're going to develop technology, and they give it a military spin, don't they?
Dual use, I think it's often the term.
Dual use, right. It could be civilian, could be military.
Yeah.
But even that's a little bit weird, because I'm not aware of a precedent of this where there's preemptive. There's no open hostilities between 2 countries.
I think it's gone beyond dual use now, though, because the stuff they're talking about's not cutting edge now, a lot of it now.
Yeah. Okay. So let me hand it over to you. Why don't you just summarise what these new restrictions are and what the the initial implications are? Yeah.
So a lot of it I've got from the statements on it that have come out of the Department of Justice are quite vaguely worded, actually.
I didn't even find them. I was just going on other reporting.
And then you sort of then read analysts that you trust and stuff. And a good guy called Richard Windsor, who used to be used to work for Nomura Securities. I spoke to him when he was there years ago, sort of different life almost, and now has his own blog called Radio Free Mobile,
which is very good.
Really,
I get his
really
newsletter.
good updates on every day, and his sort of take on it, which he actually modified. He did a sort of update today where he was saying that it looks like it goes even further than he originally thought. But
we should give him a shout out. Richard Windsor, if you ever listen to this and you fancy coming on the pod, I think it'd be a really interesting guest.
Yeah, he would, yeah. So he was saying, so basically the first, I mean, like what you said's spot on, like the way this has gone. It started off just sort of an effort to sort of undermine Huawei, really, I think, in ZTE. More sort of Huawei, I think.
Yeah,
the sanctions are really aimed at...
Especially when you consider ZTE had its own thing where it fucked around with other sanctions.
And the way that the US has done it is quite clever in that they've recognised that where they have a huge advantage basically at the moment is in terms of chip design, chip technology, not making them, but the actual expertise, the kit, the everything, the intellectual property, the software tools that you use in the production process, the equipment that's needed, the companies that are designing the most cutting edge chips that then go and get made by TSMC or whatever, they're all pretty much American, or they rely on American technology to some degree.
So I've got your story up if you want to refer to your table at all. Yeah,
so their whole way of trying to undermine Huawei was, let's go, they obviously network equipment and smartphones, which are the 2 big markets for Huawei, are heavily reliant on on chips, especially smartphones.
We should
to a
note they
lesser
also
extent.
attacked Huawei from a Google direction, not letting
From a
them
Google
get
direction,
proper Android.
yes, they did. Yeah, but
it's mainly
this
chips.
Stuff's
Mainly
more
chips.
more than chips.
Yeah.
The way it sort of metastasise, and their way of doing it was to make it very hard for Huawei to get access to cutting edge American technology. Basically, they said that these export restrictions basically mean that any companies with US tools in their fabs, let's say, or US origin stuff, or EDA, it's electronic design automation software, I think, which is used in chip production. If you have any of that and it comes from an American company,
even
then
down to IP, didn't they? It wasn't even the kit. So I mean, just to go from your, so
they can't sell it to Huawei, basically.
In your excellent report, which was headlined "The US Victims of Biden's Latest Assault on Chinese Tech," which features your byline photo, which was taken by me in this very studio.
Yes. Yeah.
You've got a table of where you sort of tabulate 3 categories of US company: chip makers, EDA, and fab equipment, and then you've got their sales to China. And well done sourcing all this data. That must have taken you a while.
That took a while. I've used that table a few times
right,
now,
okay,
because
so
I thought I've
you've had it
done the
stashed
thing.
there.
I'll have to.
Yeah, no,
I'll have
that's
to update it next year because
your inner analyst is doing a good job there. And so chip makers, we got people, usual suspects: Qualcomm, Intel, TI, Broadcom.
well, look at the
Nvidia.
bottom line of that table.
Yeah,
It
and
totals
so
everything, and look how much went up China. That's just China sales that is showing.
well, quite okay. Well, so
look at Qualcomm's line first of all. By the way, look at Qualcomm and Intel and how much they sold to China last year compared with 2020.
Yeah. So there's a big jump from 2020. So Qualcomm in 2020 was 14 billion, and 21, 22.5 billion. So that's a big old jump, isn't it? That's fucking 50%.
Yeah.
More. Intel not so much. TI, your stuff seems to be rounded off, so I guess they're estimates. But yeah, everyone's gone up, and then the chip makers subtotal has gone up from 65 billion to 85 billion in a year.
Yeah.
And then you've got the EDA, which is people like Synopsys, Cadence.
It's just those two that American. I think there's a third one, but it's now owned by Siemens. But they'll be affected as well because some of it
and that's
US
gone up.
origin.
And then the ones I think the ones that are most affected by this latest thing are the fab equipment ones, of which the most representative is Applied Materials.
Yeah.
And I can remember once I went on a fab tour by fab tour. It's like Fab 5 by a company when Global Foundries had just come into existence, which was spun out from AMD, and they took me to this fab in Dresden, and I just looked at all the kit. And I was able to take some photos, and there's a story on Hexus where I used to work at the time where you can see all this stuff.
It's got Applied Materials written all over it, I suppose.
It's got what?
Applied Materials written all
exactly.
over it.
Yeah, all the kit. And I'd never heard of Applied Materials at the time. And I thought, well, these people are obviously players in this space. And there'd be this one thing that just looks like an incredibly complicated bit of kit, but it'd be standing alone. And then someone would tell me that costs 500 million.
Yeah, they're hugely
like
expensive.
Yeah,
they sell a few of them a year, and it makes their
it's just an incredibly high value thing.
Yeah.
And so theirs has gone up about 25-30% in the last year.
So what that table doesn't show, but I think I put it in the text of the story, is how much of their sales comes from China now as well. So
Yes, I think you did put it in
Applied
the text of the
Materials
story.
was, I think 36% of its revenues last year were from China. It's by far its biggest market. And then the other two, which are KLA Core, I think, and Lam Research, are on about 31% each in terms of how much they sell to China. I mean, that's a huge share of your... So this is, I mean, the gist of my story, as the headline gives away, obviously, is that it's whack-a-mole, isn't it? You know, they will hurt China by doing this, which basically we didn't really say what they're going to do, but what they've done is expanded the scope of the restrictions, which, as I say, were originally targeted at Huawei, to make it really hard for you to sell to China at all, basically, for process
to do with chips.
They go up to something. So Richard Windsor said at first he thought it was anything going up to about 14 nanometer, which is, those are fairly advanced chips.
What do you mean going up to?
So from 5. So basically, the nanometers, billionths of a meter, and it's not. It's a bit of a marketing tool because it's not exactly.
It describes how.
But it's how big the transistors
how cutting edge the processing.
And the smaller, the more cutting edge, basically. So they're now at a state. I think the most advanced chips that are being made at the moment are 5 nanometer, but they're talking about doing 2 or 3 or whatever.
Yeah.
And the 5 nanometer ones, I think, get used in some Apple devices. I think some of the latest.
Yeah, I think the latest stuff that's coming out, the latest.
I mean that's really on the edge, and I think there's only TSMC that's actually cranking out chips. Maybe Samsung is. I don't know. But
Samsung seems to be catching up. I wrote a story earlier this year where they'd announced some preliminary phase of their 3 nanometer process.
Yeah, so I think
they want people to think they're catching up with TSMC, but TSMC is generally the leader.
Yeah, and I think the new restrictions make it really, really hard for Chinese companies to get access to tools that would be making chips up to 14, which is obviously a few process nodes behind 5. It's less sophisticated. Well, Richard Windsor then did.
Just to quickly say what when I was saying up to, it's a slightly pedantic point. So you're saying they could still get hold of kit that could let them manufacture on the 22 nanometer node.
But
what they're doing is they're freezing out the cutting edge stuff.
Yeah. But apparently it's so that this is again referring back to Richard Windsor from Radio Free Mobile. He did an update this morning where he said he thought it looks like it goes even further than 14. It goes all the way up to 28 nanometer.
Right.
So you're really getting up to.
That's probably what I meant to say.
You kind of. I mean, it will really cripple China's tech industry. It will really hurt them. But the knock-on effect is that it's all these companies, Applied Materials, Lam Research, which get over a third of their revenues from the Chinese market. All of a sudden, you're wiping. It's kind of like what happened to Neophotonics, if you remember, a few years ago. Neophotonics it's a tiny little optical components maker, not shown in that table, that counted Huawei as its biggest customer. I think at one stage it was getting about 50% of its sales from Huawei, only a couple of years ago.
Right.
And I looked at I think it's mentioned even in the story as well, Neophotonics, as an example of what can happen. They obviously couldn't sell anymore to Huawei after these export control restrictions came in. And Huawei now accounts for 5% of their sales. Now, the interesting thing about Neophotonics is that over that period, on a quarterly revenue basis, their revenues have only gone down by 8% because they've been able to find other business to make up for what they lost from Huawei. I don't think it's going to be very easy for Applied Materials and Lam Research and KLA Core to do the same thing. Partly because you look at the state of the world today. We're on the verge of a recession. We're on the verge of a chips glut at the moment.
I know, that was an interesting thing. And is that like a sort of Newtonian recoil from the chip drought we've had?
Yeah, I mean, the chip industry always goes like this. Basically, what happens is you get a drought that happens. Periodically, you get a drought of chips. There's not been enough investment, and then companies spend huge amounts of money on new fab facilities, and then there's too much.
Yeah,
and then it sort of balances out again.
Recoil,
and the same. Now, if you talk to these people who are people like Red Hat, for instance, whose vision is that we're all going to be living with edge networks everywhere in the next few years, and the number of chips that's going to be needed in the future is going to be 10 times as many as we have today. It might play out that it rebounds and the market then starts to move towards a new sort of reality where we need a lot more chips than we've ever had before.
And here's the question that, I mean, I look at, I might have mentioned on the pod before, I bought a car a few months ago. That's a 5-year-old Ford Focus, but I've generally only had Ford Focuses partly because I can't be fucked to think about it properly, and they seem to work. Yeah. And I was just struck by, so it's about 10 years newer than the previous Ford Focus. I was just struck by how much more whizzy automated shit there. So there's probably 10 times as many chips in that Ford Focus than there was 10 years ago. Yeah. But so you can see how that chart's going exponential. So
long term, it might do that. But at the moment, what's happened is Intel, TSMC, Samsung, other companies have pumped huge amounts of capital expenditure into building and setting up new fabs in Europe, in America, in other parts of the world and meanwhile demand's on the verge of going like this because we've now had that little bump where we came out of the pandemic, there's maybe some positive effects initially from what was going. There was this talk about we need more people to do jobs in all sorts of different sectors.
Right.
We're now coming over that into a period where there's going to be a big recession, I suspect, for 2023. And there's talk about Intel. I don't know who reported this, but there's talk of Intel like preparing like thousands of job cuts.
Oh yeah, I think I saw that on Tech Meme. Yeah.
It's so. Whatever the long-term trajectory is, we are going to have an oversupply of chips. We're going to go very quickly from having this chips shortage where prices have gone up and companies haven't been able to sort of meet orders and there's been this components crunch, to the opposite problem where there's a glut of chips, prices go down. It's to shift some of the stuff that
when
he's
they talk
made.
about prices, another link I put in my story is TSMC, which is like a double-edged thing. Because TSMC has got, I don't know if they're a record, but just silly profits. Their profits are up almost 100% year on year.
Yeah.
Because chips cost more.
Yeah.
And they make a fuckload of them.
Yeah.
But they've also announced a really significant reduction in their sort of capex R&D.
So is Intel.
Yeah.
And you look at their share price. Investors are seeing this won't last for TSMC. This is investors knowing what's coming, which is a fall off in demand, a big fall off in demand, and the knock-on effect down the sort of value chain is that companies like Applied Materials and Lam Research and KLA Core, who've been selling huge amounts of gear to China,
to TSMC or to China,
to people like YMTC, I think it's companies like that, and some of the SMIC is another one. Yeah, I think they'd already been cut off. They were already on the entity list actually, but some of these other companies that have now. This is the other thing that's happened with the US restrictions, as well as making it harder for US companies to sell into China. They've added new organisations to some of their sort of naughty lists, like YMTC is a memory chip maker in China. That's
not to be confused with the Village People.
No, and they apparently have a deal with Apple to supply memory chips to Apple, which is very controversial. It's like upset some of the US political establishment that's happening for the same reason that we don't want Huawei in our UK networks. We got the scoop on that, by the way, like reading the whole YMTC thing.
Oh, did you? Nice one.
Yeah. We reported on that before. All the sort of Newswise did, but it's the knock-on effect is that those companies that make tools and that make these big machines that you were seeing on your sort of factory tour that you did ages ago, I think they're going to find it really hard to find alternative markets and customers in the way that Neophotonics was able to do when it lost Huawei. I don't see that it's going to be that easy for them to do it. So
there's two things I take from this. So what you've just described in your piece gets into the minutiae really well. But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, there's two things that I don't get entirely. What is the US strategic end game? I mean, their stated aim is to cripple Chinese sort of tech sector on the whole. When you say that dual purpose thing is like, so it's all right if they're making it just to give teddy bears AI.
Yeah.
But if it's making missiles smarter, then we're not having that. But I'm just not aware of there any precedent in the history of the world, and obviously we're in different times, where one bloc can try and inhibit the overall development of another bloc. You look at the 20th century filled with war, but I don't remember anyone ever going, we've got to stop.
No, we didn't. But
Germany, their technological development.
But I don't think we're in the same situation then as we are now.
Yeah, obviously not. We're a lot more globalised and all that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is that even in the 80s we didn't have this. We didn't trade with Russia, obviously, in the 1980s. We didn't have.
But it still feels like a genie's out the bottle.
It's
like a lot of these things. It's the conceit of these politicians thinking they can control more than they can. I mean, maybe they'll delay Chinese technological progress by a bit.
Well, I did note this in the thing. I think this is the thing you've got to worry about is you're going to hurt US companies a lot doing this. Now, if those companies that we've been talking about, and not just the Applied Materials and the Lam Researches, but people like NVIDIA and AMD aren't allowed now to sell their AI chips to China either. And they have huge sales to China. You look at the NVIDIA's figures in that table, for instance, or what AMD's been doing in China in the last couple of years.
Oh, God, NVIDIA, the jump from 2020 to 21 is like double.
Yeah. So, if China suddenly dries up as a sort of end market for them, one thing they have to do is make cuts, and they have to cut R&D. It becomes very hard for them to fund, their own sort of technological expertise and innovation becomes a much harder thing to maintain when you're making cutbacks, as we saw Ericsson a few years ago when they stopped spending money on R&D and they got overtaken by Huawei in the whole radio unit game,
Yeah.
So that's one thing to worry about, that you hurt US innovation by doing this, because you've lost one of your biggest end user markets. That your Chinese demand is basically fueling US R&D. Yeah. And the other thing is, it's very arrogant to think China has lagged for a long time on chip technology, for sure. And if you talk to a lot of the experts, they still think it's probably years and years before they'll have the ability to do some of the stuff that the top American
firms
do. But it's really difficult. But it's very arrogant to think that a country of 1.4 billion people, I bet people were saying this about Huawei back in the 90s. They were saying, oh, there's no way. They're just copycat. They're a copycat firm.
And by the sounds of it, the Chinese further education scenario, they have a shitload more, even per capita, people going off, working their asses off, getting degrees, getting postgrad.
Totally.
And they tend to be more geared towards STEM, I think, culturally, there than we are, where we'll go and do Mickey Mouse degrees.
So to think that they're never going to catch up or potentially overtake us. And I remember talking to the one interview that I've ever done with Boy Ekholm of Ericsson, the CEO of Ericsson, which I did like a year and a bit ago in the summer. And a lot of it was talking about China, basically. And he said this because we were talking about standards bifurcation. And his thing was, in a world like that, where you have these two systems and, America is trying to sell into Africa, let's say, so is China. Or the Western system is, and you're up against the Chinese. Can we keep pace with a country of 1.4 billion people with like heavy focus on STEM, some top universities now? It could sort of backfire all this. This going from having what we were just talking about before, where China's involved in a trading relationship with you, and the sort of German approach to them, to doing what Biden's doing. We're trying to cut them off completely. It seems it could all go horribly wrong. In the
that's the
future.
broader two things, and then I'm going to move on because we're getting on for time.
By the way, the funny thing is, Trump, who started this just by poking Huawei a bit and got huge criticism as a warmonger for doing that,
and a racist,
and how awful. And now look, Biden's
exactly,
he's ratcheted this up to an extreme level, and there's nothing at all about him.
Don't get me started on the double standards when it comes to public
it's total
discourse.
Double standards.
It's very tedious. And that's not in any way going rah-rah for Trump.
It isn't. It's just who I don't like, but it's still...
Let's apply the same standards to everyone, which we don't. Two things, and then I'll move it on. First, what you were talking about this sort of... this balkanization, or this splitting of the sort of the globe into the China sphere of influence and the American sphere of influence. It exists in a soft way now, but everything America seems to be doing seems to be trying to entrench that.
Yeah.
And basically going, look, there's no reconciliation. There's no let's find a middle way and get on. There's just like, fuck China. Let's see how much we can screw things up for them. And as you say, China, I don't know if it's a cultural thing. If we were doing the same thing to Putin, he'd probably do something a bit more overtly belligerent. China tends to play the long game, and they're just like, okay, all right, you're dissing us again, are you?
It's more considered with China, whereas you get the sense with Putin that he's a bit unhinged, and that the finger could slip over onto the red button and press it at any moment.
Yeah, but it's setting the scene. Here we are. We're parents of kids. Our eldest are young adults now. It's setting the scene for the world in which our kids are going to live in, to be very much split down the middle.
Yeah.
And to have a sort of new Cold War. I know it's a cliche, and it'll have different characteristics to the sort of Russian characterized Cold War. But I don't know.
Well, let's hope it stays cold.
Well, let's hope it stays cold, and obviously people fret about Taiwan. And, back to the thing we were talking about earlier, I do think when people say, I never quite finished the point I was going to make earlier about people regretting bringing China into the global economic fold. I think one thing they're missing is that China is now in the global economic fold. The problem is, I think America's slightly abusing that situation now. They're going, all right, we let you in, now we're going to kick you out. Like America gets to fucking dictate all this stuff.
Yeah.
I also get the impression, I know a few people from the States listen to this, and it might not go down too well with them, but I think sometimes America still thinks it's America from 40 years ago. And it just isn't anymore. Yes, I know it's still got the biggest and most lavishly furnished armed forces. And yes, it's probably got the highest GDP per capita for such a large country, and lots of other things, and massive cultural influence. But I don't think it is what it once was. You hear little stories about Biden going off to Saudi Arabia and being sent back with a flea in his ear and shit like that.
Yeah.
I think things have changed, and I hope. And I listen to American podcasts all the time, and sometimes, and I've got nothing but affection for American culture, American people, the country, and all that. But sometimes I hear these Americans, even like Joe Rogan, who I've got the time for, going, "America's the greatest country in the world," and I sort of think, well, how do you qualify that?
Yeah, I think the trouble for me at the moment is because I love America as well in lots of ways, and obviously if there's going to be a world policeman and someone trying to do that job, I'd much rather have that than the Chinese doing it. But I think America's going through this. I mean, it's partly the rise of China and their system and their huge resources and the way that they've kind of got on this economic trajectory for the last sort of 10, 20 years that's closed the gap. But I think America just seems to be going through this weird crisis almost politically at the moment where, we used to have the whole sort of Republicans, Democrats thing from an outsider's perspective used to be quite civilized and people could meet in the middle and they could have conversations, and it was...
Social media has a lot to answer for.
Incredibly polarised.
Yeah,
I mean, we've said this so many times before, and it's actually happening here as well to a lesser extent, I think. But it's just quite worrying where it could all end up.
I blame social media a lot for that.
Yeah.
It feels also slightly post-empire. So the sort of thing that Britain went through almost 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Probably since the end of the First World War, actually.
Yeah.
Where we had to come to terms with the fact that we weren't the big daddy that we were in the 1800s in terms of the Commonwealth, the British Empire, Victorian era. And it takes a lot of time to have this national ego climb down from that. There are plenty of posh Brits who still probably have a superiority complex based on fuck all. And maybe there's a little bit of that. But anyway, trying to psychoanalyse an entire country of 400 million people or whatever is a bit futile. But I just wish they'd climbed down a little bit. I'm sure they got some justification for assuming the worst of Chinese intentions. But, I suppose, unless you've got anything else to say, to put a full stop on this latest assault on Chinese tech, as you put in your headline, it comes over just like lots of unilateral aggressive action. I'm not sure what the purpose of it is. It's probably just going to impoverish everyone for the reasons that you did. And to what end? I just wish they'd fucking wind their neck in a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. So the last thing, talking about geopolitical stuff, I wrote a story. So we've spoken about it a couple of times on the pod about European operators wanting American big tech companies, principally the ones who produce subscription video on demand, Netflix, Amazon, Disney, Apple, whoever, to chip in, because to chip in for the cost of building and maintaining their networks, because most of the traffic that the networks cover is this streaming video.
Yeah.
And, when you just look at it that way, and they call it fair contribution, when politically, when people start putting fair, which is one thing I hate, one thing I'm a real stickler for, is deliberately vague, subjective, open to interpretation terms, and fair is a classic example of that.
Yeah.
Fair, I could think one thing's fair, you think another's fair, who's right? How do we fucking know? I mean, it ultimately comes down to power.
All the proposals are incredibly vague anyway, so it doesn't surprise me.
Well, quite. But let's steel man their position. They're going, look, we're providing all this stuff. We're the infrastructure over which all this stuff goes. Seems only fair that you chip in, you tight bastards. And then they come out with, look at how much money you're making than 10 years ago versus us.
Yeah, well, I think that's what it's really about, isn't it?
And that's just basic sort of socialist redistribution of wealth argument that
totally.
I can tell.
It is.
which, as you're probably not surprised to hear, I'm not particularly sympathetic
I think
to.
I used that expression in my story about it.
Yeah,
no, I didn't write about Berwick.
I think I once years ago called it like telecom socialism, and even found one of those stylized pictures of Che Guevara.
Yeah, well, I know all this stuff
that
I think that the telecom community is coming out with in Europe at the moment is like something from a sort of Bolshevik party convention.
Yeah, basically saying let's have some top-down reallocation of wealth because we want more and we think they got too much.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so. And that sort of ramped up. I mean, that's been smouldering for decades, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Or at least 10 years anyway.
Yeah.
And then they've recently started ramping it up a little bit more, presumably.
Well, I think it's opportunistic because they realise big tech's not very popular at the moment.
Yes, no,
I think that's why it's. I think the telcos have gone. Now's the time really to go to Europe, which is also trying to attack big tech on other fronts. Like Google's got too much search engine power in Europe and things like that. So they're obviously aware of.
In the States, it's a lot of it is an attempt to sort of censor.
And their clouds are too big, and there's no European alternatives. Now's the time to go and say, "Hang on a minute, look at these big US
companies." Fair enough.
companies.
So you can't fault them for licking their finger, seeing where the wind's going, going. Let's have a pop. But anyway. So then there's this body called BEREC, which is an acronym, which stands for Body. It actually is a body. Body of European Regulators for Electronic Communications. So it's a sort of pan-European telecoms, sort of Ofcom type of thing.
Ofcom would be in it, yeah.
Exactly. It's a sort of conglomeration of all these Ofcom type things. Yeah. Although I don't know if Ofcom's still in it. I don't know if we're allowed in it post-Brexit.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Anyway, whatever.
Maybe,
And they published a document and they titled it BEREC Preliminary Assessment of the Underlying Assumptions of Payments from Large Caps, which stands for Content and Application Providers, to ISPs, which we know stands for Internet Service Providers. And anyway, and just one little quote, it concluded it, quote, found no evidence that such mechanism is justified given the current state of the market. And they went into it. It wasn't the longest thing. Sometimes these things that come from the public sector are like hundreds of pages long. It's only about 16, so I bothered to sort of scan through it. And the essential point they made, and I've got to give a shout out to another former podcast guest, Dean Bubley, who mentioned this to me when before we met Jarlath that day. We were out during the day at an Orange event that we can't really talk that much about because it's all off the record. But Orange got some execs to schlep over on the Eurostar, which got fucked up because they had to cancel one or two trains. And we were chatting about this and that, but we can't talk about the conversations we had with individuals. But it was sort of fairly unstructured networking thing. So we ended up just chatting to each other and analysts and stuff. And I was chatting to Dean at one stage, and this thing came up. And he made the point about, well, hold on a sec. Are the costs that operators incur in CapEx and OpEx in any way affected by volume of traffic at all? I mean, that's to paraphrase him. If you're listening, Dean, sorry if I got that wrong. This is at least one stag trip ago and several brain cells ago. But anyway, and so give Dean credit where it's due, and then there's section 3. So there was.
Well, I mean.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
So one thing I would say is, I find it hard to see how they're not, to some extent, simply because you need, these newer generations of technologies, unless we've been missold the version that you get from the CTOs and from the Ericssons and the Nokias, then you need your 4G network to support high definition, video stuff. You wouldn't be able to do it on an advanced 2G network, and that requires an investment. You've got to build out that 4G network, and it's a huge amount of money to do it.
Okay, but the counter argument is, would they have built it anyway?
I don't see why they'd have. I mean, I don't see why they build it unless the applications were there. I mean, the telcos would be better off if all we were doing was still using long distance phones and dial-up phones and not on the internet at all.
I'm not sure if that's true, because like any other providers of products and services, they're constantly looking to innovate and give you reasons to upgrade or at least reasons for stickiness.
Yeah.
So if all they were still doing was providing SMS and basic sort of 2G phone comms.
But if that's all that was
how do
available,
they compete with each other? There's always going to be pressure to innovate. Is my point.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it's got to the stage now where the telcos probably look at future generations of mobile technology, 6G, 7G, 8G, to support things like the metaverse, whoever it is, with a certain degree of horror,
metaverse,
because they've only just made these huge investments, and and if we're to believe people like Facebook, which comes out with blogs saying that the current 5G networks aren't good enough to support metaverse-like applications, you need more edge stuff there, you need more advanced technology, you need low latency that goes beyond 5G, then someone needs to spend money on that. And if we expect the operators to do it, and they're not making money, then they're going to.
Cool.
It's
okay.
like
that's a
by
good
the way,
steel
I
manning.
don't.
No, you're steel manning their position.
I'm on the other side of this argument.
But that's how we should do it. We should always try and look at the best argument, even if we don't agree with it.
The problem I have with trying to even think about things at that level, and I know someone else who does this who does it very, very well, is John Strand. He did a big report about middle mile costs and how much of it comes from the big sort of five or whatever internet companies. I just think that all of that's irrelevant to me. It's like looking at a road, for instance, right? And let's say BMW comes out with some new car that's really, really low cost and and exciting to drive, and it's a brilliant experience, and it's energy efficient, and everybody buys it, and all of a sudden the roads are congested, and they need maintaining more, beamers. And and we need to find somewhere to fund improvements, and we need to put new tolls in. Now, what would they do? Would anybody say we need to go and ask for some money from BMW?
Yeah.
No, we wouldn't. What do? We get the tax from the people driving the cars.
Yeah,
we put tolls up. We get road tax from new drivers who've put those cars on the road and started driving them.
And we quite notably don't have toll roads. Look at France.
Yeah,
you can barely go to fucking shops without paying someone some money.
If you extend that analogy to this situation, where the networks are the roads and the applications that we're running on those networks are the vehicles, they don't put any pressure at all on networks at all until someone takes it out of the parking garage of the data center and drives it down the last mile network. Yeah. And the reason that there isn't an equivalence, which is getting road tax from the person driving the car, is because operators charge flat rates for you to come along. You could be using 100 gigabytes a month in your home, or 200 gigabytes or 1,000 gigabytes. There's a fair level thing where you become sort of nutter who's basically on the metaverse all the time or something.
Well, I think they're also just trying to get people who are using it
basically you could be somebody streaming videos every night, every hour of the day, and your son's doing the same in his room, or you could be some old granny who goes online and checks her lottery ticket once in a while and orders some grocery shopping, and the amount of money that is being spent is exactly the same.
Yes.
And nobody forced them to do that. The internet companies didn't force operators to do that.
That's just market forces.
That's market forces. And you look at a lot of the reasons why operators are in trouble is to do with the same regulators that they're going to now, pleading to be more sympathetic, are partly responsible for this, with other things that I've been writing about this week, by the way, to do with consolidation, for instance. You've got heavily competitive markets where people can't make a decent return on investment. You've got a pricing system that it's very difficult to change, in the way that newspapers that started offering stuff for free online and then realised actually that's not a good idea, we need to introduce paywalls. Some have had some success with it, some haven't. No, it's very hard to see an operator being able to sort of move away from a flat rate model to sort of metered pricing. They know themselves.
That's why they're looking for.
They know themselves that it's a lot easier to go to a regulator now and say let's tax big tech than it is to try and introduce some kind of different pricing formula that sorts some problems out. Well, exactly. So all this stuff to me about your costs and where it's coming from, I just find a bit irrelevant. I don't really see why we should even think about that.
And so this document that Berwick published was split into 6 sections. First one just sort of set the scene. Second one spoke about traffic causation. And that made the good point about traffic being pulled by end users rather than pushed by providers.
Yeah.
which is good. And then the third section is relevant.
I'm glad they said that because I didn't actually look at the Berwick report.
Yeah, no, I actually did my job for once.
Yeah.
And the third section is the stuff that I chatted to Dean Bubley about at that Orange thing, where they talked about cost drivers. And they said, this is me paraphrasing, I think, the assertion that an increase in traffic... So they're addressing the assertion that an increase in traffic translates into higher costs for the telcos.
Yeah.
So this insinuated directly proportional relationship between every time someone watches House of Dragons or the Lord of the Rings thing, that it somehow costs
a bit
fucking
more.
BT some more money.
Yeah.
Which I think is provable bollocks.
I think that's provable bollocks,
Yeah.
but I think to sort of steelman the argument that it costs is that they do have to build more capable networks to cope with the amount
needs
of
to be
data
there for them to be able to
overall
stream
to stream
Lord of
stuff.
the Rings
You couldn't
in the first
stream
place.
stuff on the networks of 20 years ago. You wouldn't be able to support the sort of stuff that's going on now.
Yeah.
For instance, it requires capacity investments. But yeah, I know what you mean.
So it's
I know what
chicken and egg
Dean's
again.
saying
It's
is
chicken
that
and
each increment of stuff doesn't necessarily add on an operating cost.
And
or
Berwick's
something.
saying that basically saying it agrees that it can't see a direct relationship there, which would appear to be a really tough. If that's Berwick's position, and that's going to be the European Commission's position.
Yeah.
You know, I think I made the point. I asked the rhetorical question: how could Europe possibly demand extra payments from US big tech when it can't even make the financial case for it?
Yeah, but even if it did, even if even if another person watching Lord of the Rings did mean that you've got to bear more costs, even if that was correct, the whole pull-push argument to me totally negates that. You know, if Amazon's Lord of the Rings epic that it spent $500 million making or whatever doesn't generate any internet traffic at all if one bloke in the Outer Hebrides watches it and nobody else on the rest of the planet does.
Yeah.
It's only because we all go out and drive that vehicle down the last mile network to go back to that it generates any traffic. Those are the customers that are spending money with you on your network. And if you can't make enough money to pay for it, then you need to change your pricing system.
And as you said earlier, if they try to introduce some kind of cap that says if you're going to watch Lord of the Rings, you got to chuck us an extra tenner, then people would just fuck off to someone who's
But that's the industry's problem to figure out, and that's to do with too many networks in each market. It's to do with a rush to flat rate pricing. It's to do with all sorts of other things that the industry has inflicted on itself. They can't go and blame big tech for that.
Yeah, totally. And then just to cover the other sections, the next section was called Mutual Interdependence, where it made the point that loosely that the consumer demand for the types of content that we're talking about is a significant driver of consumer demand for CSP services.
Do you know the other thing that I would say about this, sort of moving away from the mechanics and the rights and wrongs of it, is to how it actually works in practice, is that nobody's come out with any, I haven't seen in all the lobbying about this, any very sensible proposals for how this actually works.
How you introduce this?
Yeah, so I went to, Etno's been the main group that's been lobbying for this, and I went to Etno and I said, so for a start, it's totally anti-net neutrality, because what they're talking about doing is not charging for internet usage. They're not saying that anybody who uses a network has to, who's sort of not using the wrong word, but anybody who's running applications, who's producing content to be consumed on the network, needs to pay some kind of fee. They're saying only a few companies need to do that.
Yeah.
Now, how do you tell number 5 on that list
they're all right,
that they need to pay, but number 6 doesn't? Even if, and it's just where's the cutoff? How do you work out what they pay?
It's that classic top-down.
Yeah.
What they call it, something economy, planned economy type of stuff.
Yeah. And they admitted this to me. They said, no, it's only a few companies we want to charge because of the imbalance. So, but as I say,
who decides?
But who decides? If let's say that we weren't in this situation, and that there were dozens of companies, hundreds, thousands, all responsible for, so their internet traffic levels are exactly the same as they are now, but it's not being dominated by 5 companies. It's spread across the base much more widely.
There's some nice European ones.
What would they do then?
Yeah.
They wouldn't. Then they'd have to charge everybody.
Well, that's the problem with everything that's top down.
But it's because there's an easy target that does account for a bit, that they can go and say, no, you guys need to pay up. So it's not been very well thought through. And the other thing I'd say is be careful what you wish for, because when this was first framed, it wasn't even as a you pay it, we'll charge you. They don't want to say that because that sounds like it's getting into the whole net neutrality thing of charging companies for using your network. So the way they put it was investing in the networks. They should share the investment. If companies share in the investment of something, it usually means you give them
sharing
a share
the
of the
return.
business.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want Google to own Orange
Do you know
or
what I
to
mean?
own BT? Do you want those companies to have a stake in the networks that we run in Europe?
Well, totally. I mean, I think you make a really good point, and I think they might be better off just fucking backing down. So the long and short of this Berwick thing is that they're not convinced, and then Etno came out with, which I can't remember what it stands for, European
Telecom Network Operators, I think,
something like that.
Association. They just leave the A off because then they'll have to sort of call it Etnoa.
Etnoa. It sounds like a volcano.
Well, it is a bit of a volcano, isn't it? Etno. Mount Etno.
There's a feature headline there. I wonder which of us will do it first. There's some warm ones here if you want them.
Probably unnecessary, isn't it?
We're about to wrap up. So they responded. By the way, that was Ian looking in our little Yeti for more beers and seeing that the cupboard was empty. So Etno came out of this statement. I just extracted one sort of essential sentence from it. It says, Berwick's preliminary is a tough one at this stage of the pod.
Preliminary.
Berwick's preliminary assessment does not bring new data to the table. I said it's sulkily stated in a published note, before indicating its continued hope that the full assessment will feature as yet unidentified new data more favourable to its cause. So it's basically saying it doesn't bring in new data and we're still waiting for someone to bring new data. Well, I mean, that's on you, isn't it?
But this is
you
where,
find the goddamn smoking gun compelling data.
I bring up John Strand again because I wrote my piece earlier in the week, and he knows that I sort of have different views on this from him. He's much more in the sort of camp that we should be able to charge the internet companies.
Oh, is he? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I've never chatted to him about that.
And
I disagree with you, John, on that one. Sorry.
Yeah, and his team have carried out really good research actually into the impact on these middle mile costs, as they call it, of these big five companies. And it's great. It really is good stuff. But I just think the premise is wrong. It doesn't make any difference what they're generating. That's a telco pricing model problem to sort out. It's not for internet companies to worry about that. It's exactly the same as saying lots of BMWs are being driven on the road at the moment. We need to start going and taxing BMW rather than road drivers.
Yeah. No, I'm. It's the push-pull thing.
Yeah.
I'm with you on that, and I'm also with the thing that I said I chatted to Dean about, and which I thought was the key thing in this Berwick point, which was, again, it's another chicken and egg argument. Would they invest any different?
Yeah.
They're still going to build the networks.
Yeah, well, I hadn't even thought about that. I know what you mean.
They're still going to continue to innovate. They're still going to continue to try and offer more to keep customers keen.
Well, you go back to the days of 3G. It's interesting what you say, because the 3G thing, 3G actually came before the applications. I mean, I think we got to a stage with now where...
In fact, we were always hunting for this killer app,
hunting for killer apps, but they wanted to invest in data networks. Their next thing was what goes beyond voice. What can we now offer? We need to offer mobile internet.
You look at 5G
stuff,
right now.
There wasn't anything
5G
really.
constantly seems to be a solution searching for a problem.
Yeah.
Because to consumers, all it is a bit more bandwidth.
Yeah.
And so they're going in a B2B direction. I'm sure they'll get there eventually. But the whole telecoms industry is build it and they will come.
Yeah, totally.
That's kind of what they do, isn't it?
So that's even more of a reason not to listen to them on all of this. Actually, is that they have made these investments and tried to position these high speed technologies as something that's going to fuel exciting opportunities for them in the future, and then they go and complain about
people using
it too much.
Exactly.
because they can't price it properly.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. It was a good chat. The next one is going to be from Network X. So, you might get another little
From
gap.
the red light district.
From the red light district.
We'll publish it on Thursday?
If you turn it around that quickly. Thursday or Friday, yeah. So you'll probably get the next one in about, less than a week.
Yeah.
Because we're going to go to Amsterdam to this Network X event, and we're going to shoot one from the show floor. It'll certainly be me and Ian. Hopefully we'll get some superstar guests.
Yep.
And we'll be talking mainly about the event and what we've been chatting about there. But until then, thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for that one.